Okay, praise the Lord. We're back with our School of Ministry, and today we're going to be talking about the black church in America. And actually, I feel somewhat inadequate, not because I couldn't do it, but time and resources don't allow us to stand here and talk about the whole history of the black church in America. In fact, what makes it so interesting is that we're going to be talking about 400 years of history in about 60 minutes, which means we're going to be going the express version. What I do want you to do is take advantage of so many books that have been written on this subject. One book that we have recommended for you is called The Negro Church in America by E. Franklin Frazier, and The Black Church Since Frazier. This book is actually two books together, one written by, as we have just said, Franklin Frazier. He's or was a black sociologist from the University of Chicago, and he wrote this book called The Negro Church in America back in the late 50s. Well, obviously, a lot has happened since he passed in 1959, and a update was written to this book by Eric Lincoln, who is also a sociologist, and he calls it The Black Church Since Frazier. As you read this book, you'll get a lot of information from the first part of it, and then you'll see a complete change in tone and style of writing and all of that, because the two sociologists are really different in their perspective, and perhaps in some ways at odds, and the times that they are writing about are completely different as well. So I recommend this book highly to you. This is not the only book about it, but it'll give you kind of two different perspectives on the history of the black church. There are many other books that you can look at, and you'll find some references to those in the back of that book, as well as other places you can look. All right, so let's go right here to this history of the black church in America. I'm calling this a brief historical overview because that's really what it is. It's brief, it's historical, and it's an overview. Let's start here with this first section called Blacks in America. Blacks in America. I'm going to try to give you an overview, a big picture, and in your own personal study as you read the book and other books on the history of the black church and various segments on the history of the black church, you can kind of fill in the gaps. But I really like to give you a big picture so that you can have an idea of the full scope, and then fill in the details as you go. So the first thing we want to do before we talk about the black church in America, we need to start talking about blacks in America. How did the black people get here? I mean, there's no reason to talk about them going to church if we don't know how they got here in the first place. And this notion of blacks in America and the conditions under which they came is really the context that colors and flavors the characteristics and the nature and the expression of the black church in America. So before we even get to how the black church looks or what it does or how it expresses its religiosity, we got to talk about how the black people got in America. And it's obvious that the slave trade is the principal way by which blacks came to America en masse. Every black person that came to America was not a slave, but the overwhelming majority of them were slaves. And this slave trade began at the beginning of the 15th century when slaves were actually taken out of Africa and brought into the Western Hemisphere, brought initially into Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and then ultimately into the United States of America. So these blacks who come to America do not come here on a tourism trip. They do not come here seeking fame and fortune. They do not come here like Christopher Columbus looking for a new world or a new home or a new life. They are here under duress. They are here as slaves, brought here to work as inhuman or as chattel, created as inhuman beings to work in this whole plantation system. So everything that takes place is done in the context of a slavery system, so that whether a person is black or white, if they live in America, the cloud that is over the whole nation, all of the colonies at that time weren't really a nation, but the cloud over all of the colonies as it related to black people was a cloud of slavery and racism. So even if you did have freedom as a black person, you still did not have full citizenship. You still were discriminated against, and in many places you were still treated as a slave, even though you may not have been. So the slave trade is what got the Africans here. And the ones that came here, whether they were free or slave, whether they bought their freedom or came as free, they were under this cloud of slavery and discrimination. These people who came here, since they did come from Africa, had undeniable African roots. Now that seems obvious, but I need to say that. I need to say that. They had undeniable African roots. They came from Africa, so they were African. Their roots were African. Their history was African. Their language was African. Their customs were African. Their looks were African. Their kinship relationships were African. All of these things were African. They did not have an orientation program on the Middle Passage to teach them English and to teach them how to become quote-unquote American. They were ripped straight from the shores of West Africa in the main and dumped after a horrific voyage over the Atlantic on the shores of America and put to work. So the Africanisms were in the people when they got there, but the question is how much of those Africanisms survived after they reached the shores of America. There's a lot of debate over that. Some scholars suggest that there are major African survivals. Others suggest that the process of slavery erased all of them, if not most of them, especially in succeeding generations. Obviously, the first generation had more of a memory of Africa than the next generation, and on and on and on. It got less and less and less. But the fact is that if you go to an African church, even today, African American church, there's a difference typically between the typical African American church and the typical European or white American church. And whether you say there are survivals or not, you can tell that there are some survivals, trust me. If you've ever been to Africa, you can tell as soon as you land on the continent, you step your feet on the continent, you can see that there's a correlation between the Africans in Africa and the Africans in America that call themselves African Americans. So if you ask me, I fall more on the side of the survival, that there were some things embedded in the Africans who came across the shores that they did not forget. They may have forgotten the names, they may have forgotten the titles, they may have forgotten the exact expressions, but there are some things that are embedded in our psyche, as Jung said, these archetypes, these things that are way deep down inside of us that even trauma does not erase. In fact, sometimes trauma brings them to the forefront. Well, however much you agree or disagree on the survival of Africanisms with the Africans who came from Africa to become the first slaves in America, it is a pretty much agreeable fact that much of what they brought with them was systematically stripped of them. It was systematically stripped of them on purpose or as a matter of practice. First of all, they were stripped of their kinship relationships. They were stripped of their kinship relationships because they were separated from their family members. Mothers and children were separated. Husbands and wives were separated. Fathers and children were separated. All of those kinship relationships, when slavery took place, when a person was sold, they weren't always sold as a package deal. They were sold one at a time. And so kinship was something that those kinship bonds were broken. And of course, along with the kinship bonds go tribal bonds. So it's not just my mother or my father or my husband or my child, but it's my people. It's the people who are related to me, the people who know my customs, the people who know my people, not necessarily my immediate family, but my extended family, my cousins, my friends, people who are part of my tribe. And as you know, tribal and relationships like that were very, very important in Africa and still are important to this day. If you speak to Africans who come from nations in Africa, they remember, they know what tribe they're from. And if you see one and ask the other what tribe they're from, they know what tribe the other people are from. So even to this day, even though they live in America, many of them are Americanized, many of them are 2 or 3 generations removed from actually living in Africa, they still have this tribal consciousness from having lived there. So when they come over to become slaves and they're separated from their immediate family and then separated from their tribe, that strips them of a connection to Africa that they had. Well, it gets worse because as you separate a person from their tribesmen, the slave process made sure to separate people from other slaves who spoke the same language. Because if we have 2 or more slaves who can speak the same language, they might get together and decide to overthrow the master, and we can't have that. So they separated families, they separated tribes, they separated people who spoke the same language, and in all of this separation process, the end result, or one of the end results, was that all of the customs that would come through kinship, come through tribal relations, come through language, were spread out in such a way that they could not be reinforced, that they could not be reproduced. So the only way that anything was able to be kept or survive is the degree to which there was commonality among African tribes and nations and family types across the tribes, which there certainly was. There were things that they had in common, even though there were also things that they did not share. So I said all that to say this, that before we talk about the black church in America, we have to acknowledge that whatever the black church came to be, it came to be after and as a result of a slave trade that brought Africans from Africa in a horrific process, brought them to America, put them to work, separated them from their kinfolk, from their countrymen, from their language, from their custom, and then in so doing made it more difficult for them to remember, to reproduce, and to continue their heritage from the homeland. Okay, so we got the blacks in America. Well, now that we got blacks in America, the next step is to talk about blacks in American churches, because that was the next progression. So when blacks came here, it is possible that some of the blacks that came were Christians, but again, it's not very likely that many of them were. In the most part, in overwhelming numbers, the Africans who came here practiced their own African religions, if they practiced any at all, and they were introduced to Christianity on these shores into the churches or into the Christianity of the white masters and the white people who met them here. So black churches don't start off, they don't land from the ship and then start black churches. The introduction of the African slaves to Christianity was through the white persons that brought them in. Now, I do need to tell you something which you probably already know from history, and that is that there was a great debate at the beginning as to whether or not to introduce Christians or Christianity to slaves. Because if you introduce Christianity to slaves, the argument went, maybe we would have to treat them equal like other people. If they become Christians as we are, so goes the argument, then we may have to liberate them and can't keep them slaves. And there were Christians who fell on both sides of that argument, that once an African slave became a Christian, that they could no longer be a slave because their salvation immediately liberated them and make them equal to other men. And then there were others who said that even though a slave was a Christian, that slave's status as a slave did not change. And that's where the laws tended to lean during that period of time. And because of that, certain white Christians felt freer to share the gospel with Africans, because otherwise that would have a major impact on the economic slave trade. So the first place that Africans were introduced to Christianity was in the homes of white people, in the homes of the masters that they belonged to. Many of these masters, if they did not have meetings at their home, they had Christian activities going on in their home. They had a Bible in their home. So many white masters, particularly the women, found themselves teaching their slaves how to read. And what they taught them how to read was the Bible. They figured you couldn't get any problems with teaching anybody how to read the Bible, so that's one of the reasons why they taught them to read, and that was the major textbook that they had. So in the homes of their masters, they began to get familiarization with Christianity. Then secondly, on white-owned plantations, these slaves were allowed in many instances to have their own congregations. And we know as early as 1758 that the first known slave congregation was on the plantation of a fellow by the name of William Byrd in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. It was called African Baptist Church, or the Bluestone Church. So this is very early. This is even in the middle of the 18th century. Where before 1776, before the American Revolution, we have a congregation of black people, but it is on the plantation, which means it is still in the sphere of slavery and in the sphere of the white master. And here's something else you also know, and that is that many of these congregations, if not most of them, they were supervised in their activities. They were allowed to meet. They were allowed to, quote, worship and praise the Lord in their own manner, but they did have somebody sitting in the back representing the master. And I don't mean another slave, but I mean somebody, a white person sitting in the back supervising their worship to make sure that their worship didn't get out of hand and that they didn't turn from worship into rebellion. This is again is something which existed and persisted for many years. But it starts in the home of the white master slaves. Then congregations began to spring up on plantations, and then we find blacks in established white churches. These are not blacks who have their own church on the plantation, but these are blacks who go to church with white people. All right? As early as 1669, which is prior to the congregation on the plantation we just mentioned, there's a record of an African named Emmanuel who is baptized in a Lutheran church in New York on April the 14th. So Emmanuel, whoever he is and whatever his last name is, was a member, quote, or at least a part of a Lutheran church in 1669. So there are many records of Africans, of slaves, of black people, whoever you want to call them, who belong to established white churches. They don't have the same rights, they don't have the same privileges, they don't get to sit in the same place, but they are in the congregation of the white church. They may be in the back, they may be looking through the window, but they are hearing the same preaching, listening to the same sermons. They are in the congregation. And then you have, fourthly, as talking about how blacks get into the American churches, they come in as converts to various denominational proselytizing. And you know, proselytizing is a fancy word of making disciples, evangelizing, so forth, trying to get members to your faith and your denomination. And one of the things that we see is that there was a great push in the early 18th century. A great revival spread around America. It began in Europe with the Methodist movement of the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, and came across the continent, across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, to the American colonies in the form of what we now call the Great Awakening. And Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and others went about the colonies preaching. They preached to thousands of people, believe it or not, in cornfields. I don't know how they did it without microphones or without megaphones, but some way or another, they would have thousands of people together. They would be able to preach, and thousands of people were saved. There was a great awakening. And in this revivalistic fervor, in the white church, it began in the Methodist church. This fervor that began in the white churches, where they were preaching to white people in particular, it spilled over in terms of also preaching specifically to African slaves. There were some African slaves who were a part of the large white congregations, but this sense of going directly to the slaves, this sense of trying to evangelize the slaves on purpose, was something that came into being around the turn of the 18th century. So it was not just, well, Aunt Jane is one of our slaves, and we invite her to the family table when we say prayer. It's not just Deacon Leroy, well, he may not be a Deacon Leroy, but Tom, who is a slave, we bring him with us when we go to our regular church. Now these established white churches and denominations put it on their agenda as a specific item to reach, to proselytize, to convert, to evangelize, to disciple black slaves. That's a major, major step. It's not something that's done by osmosis or accident. It's something that's done on purpose. So let me run through this list of some of the instances that we see this happening in terms of proselytizing from established white denominations toward African slaves. In 1706, Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan minister, writes an essay called "The Negro Christianized," an essay to execute and assist that good work, the instruction of the Negro servants in Christianity. So he actually writes an essay not only supporting but giving instructions on how you can teach your servants to become Christians. So this is something that several people took advantage of. Number one, because these are people who can be saved as well. But how do we do that? And given the cover of not having to free your slave when you make him a Christian, then a lot of people took advantage of that. And then, of course, I mentioned the Great Awakening, which kicked off in a big way in 1720. In 1738, George Schulius and Peter Boher sent to Savannah, Georgia. They were sent to Savannah, Georgia by the Moravians to minister to the slaves. So they're going down to Georgia to do this by Moravians. Of course, they are a branch of the Protestants that came across the ocean, the Moravians. In 1743, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. This is a branch or an extension of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. They open a school for blacks in Charleston, South Carolina. And when you see these denominations opening schools, the school is sort of a gateway into the black community, because many times, as I said, as people did in their own home, the textbook was the Bible. And the purpose of them opening a school was to teach them how to read so that they can prepare them to become a part of their denomination. In 1760, the Anglican Church opens a school for slave children in Williamsburg, Virginia, to learn to read the Bible and the Catechism of the Anglican Church. The Catechism, again, as you well know, is the rules, the regulations, the doctrine, the discipline that converts into the Anglican Church need to know, to understand, to recite in order to become Christians. Those persons who are familiar with Catholicism know that if you want to become a Catholic, you just can't roll up into church and say, I want to become a Catholic, and that's it. You have to go to catechism school. And when you go to catechism school, they teach you the catechism, and once they know that you have sufficiently learned that, then you can become a Catholic person. Well, the Anglican Church had a catechism just like the Catholic Church, but in order to learn the catechism, you probably needed to know how to read. So they taught the slaves how to read so that they could read the Bible and be prepared for the catechism to become members of the Anglican Church. They didn't just go down there and say, come on, be a part of our church. They realized that it took some kind of education for them to become a part of the Anglican Church, and so they provided that in 1760. That's a long time ago, y'all, 1760. Then in 1761, a man by the name of Samuel Davies died, and the reason why it's important that he died is because before he died, he baptized over 100 blacks into the Presbyterian Church. So we're talking about in 1761, one man winning more than 100 black people into the Presbyterian Church. These are black Presbyterians. And then 1766, there were two meetings held by Methodists in America. One was held by a man by the name of Robert Strawbridge, and the other by the name of a man named Philip Embury. And both of these meetings were held in proximity to each other, and at both of these meetings there were black people present. So the first meetings of any Methodist bodies in America had black people in them. So from the very beginning, there were blacks involved in that movement of Methodism here on the shores of America. In 1773, a black pastor named Palmer baptized slaves at Silver Bluff, South Carolina, and established a church there. 1801, John Chavis was the first African-American home missionary commissioned by the Presbyterian Church to be a missionary to the slaves. So he lived in America, and the Presbyterians sent him into home mission to be a missionary to the slaves, African on African conversion and Christianity. 1858, the Presbyterian Church found what is now Lincoln University, the first institution for higher learning for black people. That was something founded by the Presbyterians for the African Americans so that they might be able to increase their knowledge. 1864, St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Baltimore was dedicated as the first parish for African Americans of the Roman Catholic